Welcome. I'm Ron Baker, the director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Center, sponsored by Small Church Connections. This is us, Canadian Small Churches in Action podcast. And today, again, we have a great opportunity to listen to someone, to see them, unless you're listening to this on one of the MP3 podcasts, but otherwise you could actually get to see who this is. And I'm going to let her introduce herself and just tell us a bit about her ministry journey and all that sort of stuff. And so here you go, Wendy. Oh yeah, that's who it is. Yeah. Take it away.
Well, thanks, Ron. I really appreciate this opportunity to just share what God has done in my life and just my passion for small church ministry. My name is Wendy McCready, and I live in Alma, Ontario, population 300 people.
Wow.
With my husband, Mark, and my two daughters, Anna and Olivia. Anna will be turning 16 in about a month or so, and Olivia is 11. So my husband is the pastor of Alma Bible Church, which has an attendance of about 150. Give or take. COVID has changed a lot of things, so it's a little hard to know for sure where our number's at. But we've been ministering there for over 10 years. So ministry journey, I had to kind of think back. I would say it really goes back to my teenage years, where I first started volunteering at the camp I grew up going to as a child. I liked to serve there wherever I could in the kitchen. Eventually was serving as program director the summer after I was finished with high school. I grew up in Southeast Michigan, so I also was able to minister at camps in the state of Michigan during my interspersed throughout my summers when I was a student at Moody Bible Institute. That's where I went to school. And while I was at Moody, I also, as far as ministry experience, I was able to minister with the women's choir. I sang with that group, and we did a number of mission trips overseas. And then also we took tours throughout the United States. We would usually pick an area and kind of like go out east and have a whole 2 weeks where we would stay in little churches all throughout. So it was actually during that time that God really put in my heart to be involved in small church and in rural ministry. Of course, I grew up serving, I was a student at Moody for 4 years, where, you're right in the heart of the inner city. And that was obviously the big push as well, as far as us as students, was to let's reach the cities for Christ, and then we're going to reach the world. Yeah. But God really had put a passion in my heart as I went on these tours, as we stayed with people in these churches. Most of these churches were very small churches, and it would be a real test for them, a challenge for them to find enough homes to billet 50 women who were there to sing a concert in their town. And so that really just helped me to realize that there is a need for people to share the gospel in these small places as well. And I also at that time was able to connect with Ron. Too many Rons, sorry. I'm just thinking I want to say the wrong Ron Clausen, who is the director of Rural Home Missionary Association. I know there are some relationships and connections through you and through Ron Johnston as well.
We actually just finished a podcast with him about a week or so ago.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah.
No, Ron and I have known each other for over 20 years. I met him when I was a student, and I was quite excited to meet him just because I realized that there are other people out there who also have a passion for this vision. So it was very affirming to me when I was able to meet him as a student, when he was actually the speaker at our missions conference, I think my second year at Moody. So anyway, that was really where I got connected with rural ministry. And by the time I was finished at my time at Moody, really felt, or nearing the end of my time, I had been ministering, as I said, in camp ministry and young people. I had my degree was a bachelor's of education through them, and with a focus on youth ministry, but really felt God was calling me to be a pastor's wife in one of these small towns. So I actually met my husband. He wasn't a student at Moody, but I met him through friends at Moody. I met his brother and his brother's wife there, and they got married while we were still at Moody. So Mark would come and visit them, and the rest is history. So we ended up together, and we got married about a year after I graduated from Moody, a little bit less than, and then the following fall, he started his seminary education in Denver Seminary. And so that's where he continued on his education, because he actually is from Canada. He's from Kitchener-Waterloo area. That's where he was born and raised. And so he really felt God was calling him into ministry, but he kind of pushed it off quite a while, and finally could not ignore the tap on his shoulder anymore from the Spirit of God. And so we went into our marriage knowing that this was a journey that was going to be ahead of us. And again, was affirming for me, knowing that that's what God had called me to, as being a pastor's wife. So we ended up going to the seminary then for 4 years out in Colorado. And when Mark finished his time there, we had been connected with Alex Strauch, he's written a number of books about church leadership, is connected with the Brethren assemblies. So that's the background that Mark has. He was his mentor during his time in Denver. And so we ended up getting a connection with him to a church in the Northern Ontario cottage country. So that was where we ended up after he finished seminary, and my husband ministered there for 7 years as their full-time pastor. And then we ended up moving to Alma about 10 years ago. And so that's kind of our ministry journey, where we ended up and how. And so it was, that's a very short summary of about 25 years there or more. I don't want to know how old I am.
Yeah, that's very well done. I could ask you all sorts of questions and, people that you might know and all that sort of stuff, but we'll leave that for another time.
Yes, it is a small world that we live in, literally, especially when it comes to small church ministry, I think.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Okay, my own background comes out of a Brethren in Christ background. And I guess it'd be my grandmother would come from around the Kitchener-Waterloo area.
Okay, good.
And so, you never know with all this thing, we might be related. So
that is possible.
It's very possible.
If your last name's Martin, for sure. That's what we find around here. Martin or Brubaker, you're all related somehow.
Yeah, there you go. Oh, okay. We'll go on to the next question, because otherwise, yes. Okay. You write for Flowers for Pastor's Wife, for the Pastor's Wife, at smalltownpastorswives.com. What is the mission of that whole group? Can you give me just a little bit of fill in on that? I mean, you've talked about how you wanted to be a pastor's wife and all that sort of stuff. I'd love to hear what you guys are doing.
Sure. Well, to share about the mission of Flowers, as we affectionately shorten it to, it really is to share my story as a pastor's wife in a small town or a small church. By the time I'd been a pastor's wife for just a few years, I had learned pretty quickly that being a pastor's wife can be a very lonely place. I would make friends with women in the church, and then their husband would get upset with something my husband did, and then suddenly that relationship was awkward, or it just became cold, and it really complicated things. And of course, I suppose in my youth and naivety, with my excitement and passion for just changing the world for Christ, there was some of that, I think, for both of us, just because it was part of our maturity as we grew in ministry. But it also, as time went on, I realized this is not just my naivety. This is just the reality of ministry, especially in a small town context. Church politics gets messy no matter where you are, of course. But I think for small town pastors' wives, you don't have anywhere to turn to confide in anybody. I can't even go to the pastor's wife down the street and chat with her, because we probably have the people that are causing our problems are probably the ones that left their church and came to ours. So it really does get messy. So I just really began bringing that passion, that desire before the Lord, because I felt like, I'm sure I'm not the only one feeling this way. And as I've already referred to the RHMA, and now you certainly have familiarity, having had Ron on for an interview as well, they have a pastors' conference every year in Illinois, and they're at their headquarters, or near their headquarters. They hosted in a church that's near their headquarters. And my husband and I had gone to those ministry conferences over the years, because we found them, for my husband especially, he found if he would go to other conferences, so much of what they talked about was just not applicable to our context. And it was very frustrating for him. Whereas when we would go to RHMA conferences, we just felt like, oh, these people get what we're doing.
Yeah.
And so I definitely felt that way at the times I was able to attend with him. But I felt too that, okay, we need something like this for pastors' wives, because the focus, of course, was still the ministry as a whole, ministry to the pastors. They did have sessions for the pastors' wives as well. But of course, you can only have so much focus at a conference. And so I had this desire to really see more done for pastors' wives. And so you kind of I have to back up a little bit into my life, because when I was at Moody, I knew of a girl whose name was Dana Buznitz. She and I both were in music groups. We both had an interest in RHMA. In fact, she and her husband were church planters with RHMA. She graduated a year after I did. So our paths didn't really cross. However, I believe it was April in 2016, after one of the sessions at the conference, because it's held every year in April, we literally kind of ran into each other in the foyer of the church where the conference was being hosted. And it just was one of those moments where I knew God had orchestrated our meeting, because our conversation was all of about 5 minutes. I don't even know why we started talking about what we did. Maybe it was after one of the ladies' sessions, and we just said, we need something more for pastors' wives. And Denna's vision was to do something along the lines of a blog, some kind of writing ministry. And so we exchanged contact information at the time and decided that we would just pray about where God would have this go. And it was kind of, I wouldn't say on the back burner, but really just for about 6 to 8 months or so, we just kind of kept in touch occasionally, prayed about what God would have us to do. And then as time went on, God brought another pastor's wife in our path that likes to write. And then we had somebody that was interested or willing to help us build a website, graphics people. And God just started to put together this team of women, almost all of whom are pastors' wives themselves. We do have one team member, Lynette Goebel, who is actually a part of our HMA as well. She is not a pastor's wife, but absolutely loves pastors' wives. And so she writes a column for us called Flowers for My Pastor's Wife, which is kind of her encouragement to other people as to how they can support their pastor's wife. And ends up honestly being very encouraging to us just to read, because she seems to get us, even though she has not been one herself. So that's what happened. God brought all those pieces together so that by September 2017, we were able to post our first blog and launch our website. And so together, Denna and I direct this Flowers ministry with our team of over 10 pastors' wives now. I think we're up to about 14 or 15 now on our team. And we purposely set it up that way for a number of different reasons. We all are busy women who do not have a lot of extra time in our hands, but we do need that support. And we felt that this way, if we were able to get enough people on the team, there wouldn't be a huge amount of pressure on one person, because to keep up on a regular blog, you have to have material. And so we've been totally amazed to see how God has brought it together, and we're never hurting for filling slots, it seems. And we've now been putting blogs up since 2017. So we also have a private Facebook group, or a community Facebook group, that you have to register as a pastor's wife to be a part of it. And that gives us a safe place where we've been able to do reading groups where we've studied books together, and a place for us to put up prayer requests for people, so they have a connecting place to share things that they maybe can't safely share in other places. We also have been able to publish a couple of digital products over the years. And then just recently, I actually have right here, this is our recent publication. It's called Love, Joy, and Faithfulness, a 90-day devotional for the pastor's wife. And it is basically just a compilation of writings from our first 3 years of our blog. We just finished our 4th season, or finishing it up. We started blog seasons in September. So yeah, this is a 90-day devotional for pastors' wives specifically, but could be certainly used for any ministry wife in any context too. It's not written necessarily just for small town and rural pastors' wives, although that is our focus in our writing. It certainly can apply to any others. So yeah, it's been very exciting to see God put that together, and it just, we trust, will really multiply our reach as far as sharing resources with other pastors' wives, so they don't have to feel alone like I did. That's really where I've been at with it. And this ministry has personally met that need for me, because I have been able to develop friendships with these women that we've been able to support and encourage one another in our ministry as small town pastors' wives. So it's been pretty exciting to see what God has done.
Yeah, and as you're blogging and you're looking at all that, how would you say, what would you say makes for a flourishing pastor's wife? You know, someone who's just wants to be there and just enjoys it. You know, what is a flourishing pastor's wife? And I say that I have had, I mean, pastor's wife. I've been a pastor. Yeah, what makes a flourishing pastor's wife?
Well, the word that came to mind as I thought about this question, Ron, is that I really think it can be summed up kind of with our mission as Flowers. Like, our mission is to encourage, equip, and connect small town and rural pastors' wives. And I think the key really is that a pastor's wife needs to be encouraged to flourish. And again, that was why we started this ministry, because we knew that's what we needed to make it. And so I think that can be done in a number of different ways. I think especially as a member of a congregation, that a pastor's wife needs to be loved as an individual.
Yeah.
It is very difficult as a pastor's wife to separate yourself from your role. And I think it's difficult for people to do that as well. They see, in fact, I always tease people when, they ask, or I get introduced as, well, this is Mark's wife. And like, well, by the way, my name is Wendy and I'm actually a separate person from him, not that I resent it at all. I mean, I've made it very clear already that I feel, I felt God's call to be a pastor's wife. And I know it's not like that for every woman. So I do not want to set that up as an expectation for people. But I went into this, in a sense, knowing what I was getting into, believing this is what God wanted me to do. But it doesn't mean that my role defines me completely. So I think that for a pastor's wife to flourish, or any ministry wife, because I know sometimes we have, women who are ministers and then you have a pastor's husband. I spoke with Karen Stiller about that actually when I did a podcast with her a few years ago for EFC. But I think that regardless, that role can sometimes supersede who a person is as an individual. And the best way I think to help a pastor's wife flourish is for somebody to see them as a person and not just as their role. Because obviously who I am and who anybody else is as a pastor's wife is totally different. We have different backgrounds, different personalities, different giftings. So we can't really be put in a box, I don't think, though people do try to do that. I also think that the pastor's husband, or rather the pastor's wife's husband, the spouse of the ministry person, the spouse needs to be supportive and encouraging as well. And I think that can be done through them supporting the people in understanding that my wife is an individual, and no, she may not do all the things you think she should do because that is not where she fits. That's not her gifting. So I think that that's another way they can flourish, is to have the support of their husband, and definitely to have the support of the people and just being who God has created them to be, regardless of what the sort of supposed expectations are of that role.
Okay, let's go into that question of expectations.
Sure, I kind of made a nice segue for you there.
Yeah, just works
not
great.
Necessarily intentionally, it just worked.
Well, and small churches, there is a different expectation in small churches than in larger churches. So, what have you seen in that whole area?
Well, I've already said it already, but I really think the expectations of a pastor's wife are as many numbered as there are churches in the world. Each church has its own culture, each community has its own culture. So that comes with it. It's a whole level of, different expectations. So for example, in the first church where my husband and I served, the previous pastor's wife was a very quiet woman. You would never see her up at the front. She loved ministering in the library, and she took care of all the bulletin boards in the church, which I don't know if people hardly even do those anymore, but at those days, that was what was important. She was a quiet, behind the scenes serving kind of lady. I don't know if you figured that out yet about me, but I am definitely not like that.
Really?
I can serve if I need to, but there I come into this church, and I'm a singer. I'm used to standing in front of people. I've led groups of people over the years in my camp ministry, and so I'd be up at the front, and I love hosting people in our homes. So we're having people over every week. I was the very, very opposite to this lady, and thankfully I didn't really experience a lot of pressure from the people in that church to be a certain kind of person. But in my current church, I didn't see that quite as much either until I stayed home with my girls when they were younger. But as they were getting closer to the age to begin to go to school, I started pursuing getting back into working as an EA in the school system. And so I was doing some supply work here and there. And the plan for us long-term was for me to work full-time while the girls were in school. So at one point I had a woman in the church approach me who basically said, well, you can't do that and be a good pastor's wife. And again, the irony of this was that my husband is actually the first full-time paid pastor in this church, because having the Brethren Assembly background where you have elders leading the church and teaching and itinerant ministers usually coming in to fill the pulpit, our church is a church plant. So to me, it was kind of ironic that, there was this expectation that I would be a certain way when they never even had a pastor's wife before. But obviously it just shows that it's typical in any relationships. We all have expectations without realizing it until they're not met anymore. And that's how it was for this precious lady too. I didn't hold it against her. I knew she meant well. But it just demonstrates that people do have expectations, whether they realize it or not. And they may not realize it until that person doesn't meet it anymore. And then suddenly they, get their feathers ruffled. So I think that what often happens in a small community, especially, is that, there's sort of these general expectations, but when it, like you asked me to address specifically in small church, and I think it has to do more with kind of the small town rural culture.
Mm-hmm.
And, there tends to be more of a traditional mindset in communities like this. So, even the expectations that I feel here overall, there's expectations to be stay-at-home moms, you raise your children, you support your husband in the church, and you do whatever work is left that needs to be done, like the nursery or whatever it might be, helping in the kitchen. And I think not only just expectations of the role as far as the specific roles for the woman, but I think there tends to be a general expectation that the pastor and his wife should sacrifice for the church, so they don't ever have nice things, or their kids should be better behaved, or they should show up to everything that's going on at the church because that's what a good pastor and pastor's wife do. So I think the list could go on and on and on. As far as, I think some of that has changed a little bit as society's expectations of the role of women have changed.
Yeah.
But like I said, I think in smaller churches, there tends to be more of that traditional mindset. So if you have, like for me, pursuing a career separate from what I am or do as a pastor's wife, it's hard for people, and the fact that I don't play the piano, I don't fit either, because pastors' wives already play the piano. Like, I mean, I've used that line before. I don't play the piano, I play the flute, but I can't do both at the same time,
That's very true. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't sing and play the flute. I can lead music with it. So, but I kind of do say that purposely to help people to recognize that, okay, do you realize you have an expectation that doesn't necessarily fit every person that actually ends up in this role as pastor's wife? So as far as differences in a larger church, again, I think it has to do with cultural expectations. Urban and suburban churches tend to be larger, not necessarily. There certainly are small churches in urban areas, which you've certainly, I'm sure, experienced in your supportive ministries of small churches. So I think the expectations tend to be a little bit different, but they still have people, thinking they should fit a certain role, or thinking that their kids should act a certain way, or, that they should be doing something that fits their construct, right? So I'm not sure if that totally answered the question, just because I think the answer to the question sort of is that there's a lot of answers, right? I think that's kind of how I would conclude it. So
yeah, I mean, I look at my wife, and she best serves on the facilities and management of the property as a sort of construction background. Her full-time job is painting, and she loves to design. That is not the usual expectation.
No.
So yes, it has changed over time, no question about it. Okay, let me just ask you a question now. I talk about my wife being in a very different role. You're doing the EA thing and that whole thing. If you look at that, how do you reach out into the community? I mean, and maybe that's just it. You are reaching in the community. Well, I'll let you sort of chat a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I thought about this on an individual level and a church level. And I think the challenge, first of all, if you think about the church level, the challenges of smaller churches is that we don't feel we have enough money and people and resources to reach out. We tend to sort of have an inferiority complex, I think, as small churches, that we think, and the reality is we're often so busy just trying to maintain so that the church doesn't fall apart, because we've only got so many people to do things, that we tend to be very ingrown in our thinking. But I really believe that the Great Commission is not the Great Suggestion. So we obviously have a responsibility to, and a privilege to reach out to others, no matter who we are or what size of church that we are. And of course, that has to begin at an individual level. And you're totally right, Ron, that for me, part of the reason I want to be in the workplace is because my husband is in the church all of the time. And it's very easy to lose sight of why we do what we do. Again, it's easy to get that ingrown mindset and to forget that, oh yeah, there are lost people right out our doors. Well, I don't get to avoid that, because every day I'm working with people who are very lost and who need Christ. And so I know my husband has often tried to challenge our people as well, that, you're the only Jesus some of these people are ever going to see. I'm not going to be able to stand, meet some of those people and tell them about Jesus unless you manage to bring them into the church. But the point is that your life and what you do and what you say is what's going to have an impact in bringing others into the kingdom. So I definitely think that reaching out primarily must come from that individual one-on-one relationships that we build with people around us through our natural connections with, a mom who goes to play group, or a guy who, works construction, like your wife, for example.
Yep.
And for me, it's the schools, and anybody who has lived in Canada as a Christian long enough knows that this public school system is a huge mission field. And that's what I felt God calling me to, is I knew my time in life and season was transitioning with my daughters getting older, that we need to be able to be a light and a testimony in the world. And so I feel like there's a huge advantage for me doing what I'm doing, because we're able to stay connected with those that need Christ and not lose sight of the fact that it's not just church people in the world. So that's what I would say as far as reaching out to the community individually. But as a church, just for example, I mean, some of the things that we do, I've tried to do over the years, are typical kinds of outreaches, where we do a kids program, of course, in the summer that I have the privilege of running with another lady from my church. And we are able to have over the years hosted family events. Like we had a corn roast a number of years back, where we would invite the community for free food, and we would have bouncy castles for the kids and those kinds of things. We've shifted a little bit from that, and one year tried a pigs and rigs event where we had
Pigs and rigs.
Pigs and rigs, yeah.
Okay, this sounds great.
great country kind of outreach. Yeah, so we had a pig on a spit, and we had roast pork, so kind of a big community feast.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had big rigs parking in our parking lot, because our church is literally like planted in a cornfield, or beans, or whatever happens to be out for that season or for that year. Yeah, and then families could come and tour the big trucks and the harvesters and that coaches and different things that we had. And so we use that as an outreach in our community. We've also tried weekly kids clubs, and then hosting like a Christianity Explored Bible study for the adults happening at the same time. So if parents wanted to stay, if they were interested in hearing more about God and his word. And so we've tried different things like that as far as reaching out as a church and a community. Those are things that have worked for our community. And we've also found, we were also quite blessed right before COVID hit. We have a couple of churches in our community besides ours. We have a Presbyterian and a United Church, which are even smaller than we are. But one of the ladies from that church has a dramatic background, and she put together a trek to Bethlehem. So we did a live nativity in our community park and community center. So many people from our church participated in that. And in that way, we were able to reach out as a group of Christians to our community, which was a really neat thing we all found, was that we could, even though we weren't from the same churches, we all, of course, want to share the true story of Christmas. And so we had literally thousands of people that came into our community for that trek before COVID hit. So those are just some of the things that we've tried to do to reach out. But I do really believe that, the best way people are won to Christ is one-on-one.
Yeah.
And those events certainly do work to draw people in and present to the community that we care enough to put on something, for them, I think. But ultimately, it's those one-to-one relationships that we build with others that I think make an impact, because people can really see Jesus lived out in our lives.
I find it interesting. Small towns, small churches, even in urban centers, tend to have to go find somebody else to work with. So when you talk about, we worked with Presbyterian Church, United Church, for us and for myself, the church that I'm working with, we have to work with other churches. Right. Versus if you're a large enough church, I guess you don't have to necessarily. You can, but you don't have to necessarily do that. That's a really important part of working together.
Right. Well, and I think it is a value of being in a small church, because it does teach you that you do need each other. And again, teaches you that there are ways to reach out without having a lot of resources. And I know, as you obviously we've already referred to Ron Clausen, but the book that he and John Kessler wrote about, No Little Places, they talk a lot about the fact that as a small church, you need to focus on what your strengths are, instead of thinking about all the things, we can't do this, we can't do that, like the church down the road. There are a reason why people stay in our church, because they value the community, they value the family feel, they value the long-term relationships that you can build with people, for example. The discipleship that you can, not that you can't have it in a larger church, but you have to do it a lot more intentionally, and it's almost
Right.
harder too, because the dynamic itself lends itself towards showing up and leaving, or just coming to a program and going home. Whereas you don't get to hide from people like that in a small
You sure don't. No, you
because
don't.
people notice when you're gone, and they're probably calling you, texting you before, they're even out of the building going, hey,
Yeah.
where were you today? Which has its pluses and its minuses. But,
Yeah.
for those that want that connection, and I think increasingly in our fractured society, people are looking for that. I think we really can, as small churches, meet a need that a large church can't necessarily in the same way. And I'm certainly not diminishing the work that they do, because every church has a purpose in,
Yeah.
the larger work of the body of Christ. But as far as our focus as small churches, I think we can remember that we do have advantages from our perspective. So
You've sort of wandered into a question. I've got like a whole bunch of questions now, and so we're and we actually
outside
have
of the scripted ones.
yeah, outside of those ones.
Okay.
Yeah, and unfortunately, like, time's up. So, but I'll just step into this last question, and then
Sure.
some other time maybe get together and chat again. This last question really is: in this last while, we've had to rethink church. And I talking with various leaders of churches and small churches and that type of thing. It's just very different what we're looking at. And you even implied that too, when you said we have 150 people that come to our church. We think we're not sure now,
Right.
So what is church?
Yeah, I had to chuckle to myself when I saw that question, Ron, just because my husband and I have spent hours discussing this in the past year, right? Because I'm sure you can attest to the fact that probably even in your own church, you've experienced the two extremes, where you had the people that were so relieved to be able to slow down because they've been so busy and so peopled out that they were glad to hide away, to the opposite extreme of people that were pushing every restriction as soon as they could, because they couldn't wait to do something again and be with people. So, we found it a challenge to sort of bring people together in that. And I think really what we learned is that, the church obviously is not the building. I remember as a young girl in Sunday school, we had a printed off picture once of a little maze, and we're supposed to draw a line to the person and connect them to the church. And of course they throw you off by putting a picture of a building and a picture of people in the one corner. And I probably got the wrong answer at that age too, because we tend to think of church as a place and as the building and as the programs and kind of what defines us in that way. But the church obviously is the people. And what my husband really, what we talked about and what he actually unpacked in a sermon series over this past year to help people, was that the church is what they did in Acts 2:42. If you're breaking bread together and you're praying and you're worshiping, that is what the church is. And to me, that can transcend, in-person meeting. I sat here right in my living room on the other side of this wall where I'm meeting with you right now. And my daughters and I were able to sit there and listen to my husband preach and know that we're connected with our people, even though they're back in their homes. And to me, the Spirit of God transcends time and place. So I feel like we had to learn that we can still be connected with one another, even though we're not in person with one another. We saw people putting together packages for the seniors and dropping them off to encourage them. We saw people learning how to make phone calls again and to connect with others that way. And really, people really did learn how to be the church without that Sunday meeting every week. Now, that said, we are physical beings, and we need that personal connection. There's no question that, there's people were anxious to get back together because they needed that connection again. And they were getting, a little bit overwhelmed by only people in their four walls of their house, right? Like that has its challenges and pluses too, depending on your situation. So it brought up a lot of challenges for people to sort of define what that means to be the church. So for us, we found that learning to define the church by our relationships with one another that can transcend whether or not we're meeting in the same time and place, I think, was something that we tried to challenge ourselves with and encourage our people with as well. Because I think that now that we can meet together again, it certainly makes you appreciate it better, and it helps you to think about your reasons for doing it rather than just showing up because it's the thing to do or it's your social event for the week. That was what we tried to challenge people with. So that's a few thoughts on that concept that probably could keep on with a bit, but like you said, we could carry on with the conversation, but
we could, but yeah, time really is up. Sort of. So thank you very, very much. I have just enjoyed this. And good to hear from you all the way from Ontario out to Saskatchewan. This has been great.
Yeah. Well,
Thank
thank you
you.
very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
All right.